Inside a teenage pharaoh's sealed tomb, archaeologists found something stranger than the gold. Stacked among the treasure was a face molded in solid gold to look flawless forever, and beside it, more than 100 walking sticks. A god isn't supposed to need a cane, so why did this one need more than 100? That question sat unanswered for almost a century until a sealed laboratory in Cairo cracked open a secret that had been hiding in plain sight, carved into stone by royal command, then buried inside bone for 3,000 years, waiting for science to finally catch up to it. Because the strange, swollen, stretched bodies carved across an entire vanished Egyptian capital were never an art experiment, they were a warning. And nobody alive at the time had any way of reading it. To understand what that warning actually meant, you have to go back to the man who ordered his own face carved wrong on purpose, a king born with the name Amenhotep IV, who inherited an empire built on a religious machine so old and so wealthy it functioned almost like a second government. The priesthood of the god Amun controlled farmland, granaries, workshops, and tens of thousands of laborers. They didn't just worship the throne. In a very real sense, they propped it up. And then this king turned around and tore that machine apart with his bare hands. Temple estates were seized, centuries-old festivals were canceled overnight, thousands of priests lost their positions, their income, their purpose, all at once. He scraped his own birth name off monuments across the kingdom because it carried the name of Amun buried inside it, and replaced it with a new one, Akhenaten, meaning roughly effective for the sun disk. One god remained, the Aten, a burning disk in the sky with rays that ended in small carved hands reaching down to touch only the king and his family and nobody else. Not the farmer, not the soldier, not a single ordinary citizen got a direct line to this god. The only door left open ran straight through the king's own body. Then he did something even stranger. He abandoned the old capital entirely, marched his entire court into open desert, and carved 14 boundary stones into the cliffs to mark the edges of a brand new city built around nothing but devotion to his god. A city that rose in under 2 years with wide, sunlit courtyards instead of the dark, secretive sanctuaries every Egyptian temple had used for 1,000 years before him. Imagine living through that. The temple your family depended on for grain and wages is shuttered overnight. The festivals that gave your year shape and meaning are simply gone. The priests who ran daily religious life are unemployed and furious, and that kind of fury doesn't disappear, it waits. But here's the part almost nobody focuses on when they tell this story. The part that should have been the bigger scandal. The religion wasn't the strangest thing happening in that new city. The body was. Somewhere in that city, Akhenaten gave his royal artists an instruction that had never been given in 2,000 years of Egyptian art. Stop making me look perfect. Show me as I actually am. And what they carved next has no precedent anywhere before or after it. An elongated skull, stretched backward like wet clay. Narrow, sloping shoulders, hips wider than the queen standing next to him. A soft, rounded belly hanging over the royal kilt, long, spindly fingers, a face that blurs every single signal Egyptian art had always used to keep male, royal bodies and female royal bodies visually separate. And it wasn't only him. The entire art style cracked open at the same time. After 2,000 years of rigid, frozen profiles, suddenly the royal family is shown bending, leaning, kissing their children, slumped casually in the heat. In one devastating scene, they're shown weeping openly around the body of a dead daughter, a level of raw, unguarded grief no pharaoh had ever allowed onto a temple wall before that moment. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. Nefertiti, his queen, is carved with that same stretched skull. Their daughters carry the same proportions, generation after generation, as though one physical signature had been stamped through an entire bloodline in plain sight, on stone, where it would outlast every single person who carved it. Foreign ambassadors who arrived expecting the towering, flawless god-king described in old treaties reportedly left the palace confused by what they'd actually seen. For decades, historians fought over what all of this meant. Some called it pure symbolism, a king claiming both male and female creative power as part of his new theology. Others called it propaganda, a deliberate visual shock campaign to sell a radical new religion. A smaller, stubborn group kept asking the question nobody wanted to sit with. What if it was simply accurate? The answer didn't come from another carving. It came from a body, found inside a tomb that someone had gone out of their way to destroy. In 1907, excavators opened a burial in the Valley of the Kings, catalogued only as KV-55, and the scene inside it told its own story before anyone even touched the bones. The coffin had been mutilated. The name had been deliberately scratched out. The golden face had been torn off the mask. In a civilization where your name surviving in stone was the literal mechanism for living forever, this wasn't robbery. This was an execution aimed at the next world, one of the most violent acts of religious punishment imaginable in that belief system. And yet, the skeleton inside refused to stay anonymous. A long, narrow skull, a jaw that matched the strange Amarna portraits exactly. For the better part of a century, researchers stared at the same fragile bones and reached opposite conclusions about whose body this even was, because identifying it correctly would mean finally testing every wild theory about Akhenaten's bizarre anatomy against real physical evidence. And theories about that anatomy had been piling up and collapsing for decades. One specialist proposed Marfan syndrome. Another suggested a hormonal disorder. Someone else floated a brain tumor, an old head injury, simple artistic exaggeration. Anything that could explain a body that looked nothing like a pharaoh was supposed to look. 100 years of calipers and rulers could not settle it. So eventually the argument moved somewhere those ancient priests could never have imagined it would end up. A sterile, sealed lab in Cairo, where DNA itself would finally be asked to testify. And before this project even started, there was every reason to expect total failure. DNA is fragile. Heat destroys it. A tomb sealed for 3,000 years in the desert behaves like a slow oven, and earlier attempts to pull usable genetic material out of Egyptian mummies had been publicly mocked, frequently dismissed as nothing more than modern contamination from the hands of the very archaeologists studying them. So the team, led by Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, alongside geneticist Yehiagad, spent close to 2 years just designing a study rigorous enough to survive the brutal scrutiny they knew was coming the moment results were published. 11 royal mummies were selected, including Tutankhamun, the mutilated body from KV 55, and an unidentified woman known only by the working title, the Younger Lady, whose face had also been violently smashed by someone determined to erase her. Samples were pulled from teeth and dense bone, the only places genetic material had any real chance of surviving the mummification process. Every sample moved through sterile clean rooms next to empty control tubes, designed specifically to catch any trace of modern contamination. And if a single control came back dirty, the entire batch was thrown out and the work began again, sometimes after weeks of effort lost in an instant. Then came the safeguard that mattered most. 2 separate laboratories analyzed the same material independently, working from blind sample codes. Neither one told which mummy they were testing or what conclusions the other lab was reaching. Only results that matched across both labs were accepted as real. Colleagues who worked beside Gad during this period have described him pausing with a sample tube in his hand before loading it into the sequencer, as though some part of him wanted the remains. Inside, to know they were finally being handled with care. 3 separate genetic markers were tracked, each revealing a different branch of the family tree. Mitochondrial DNA tracing mother to child, Y chromosome markers tracing father to son, and a panel of additional markers providing the statistical muscle to tell a parent from a sibling from a cousin with real mathematical confidence. 3 independent threads, all pointing at the same family, rather than betting everything on one fragile result. The full methodology was published openly in 2010 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, daring any skeptic in the world to pick it apart. And when both labs finally reported back, the family tree those numbers drew was not the one almost anyone in that room had been hoping to find. The least controversial part came first. 3 of the 11 mummies locked together into an unmistakably tight family unit. KV-55 as the father, the Younger Lady as the mother, Tutankhamun as their son. The man inside that deliberately defaced coffin emerged as the strongest genetic candidate for Akhenaten himself, finally identified not by inscription but by blood. Then the researchers looked 1 generation further back, at the parents of KV-55 and the Younger Lady, and that's the exact moment the study turned explosive. The markers showed that KV-55 and the Younger Lady shared the same mother and the same father, not half-siblings, which this dynasty had practiced for generations without much controversy. Full siblings. 2 children of the exact same parents, raised inside the same palace walls, eventually married to each other, who together produced the boy who would later be sealed inside a solid gold mask and stared at by millions of museum visitors a year. Sit with why that result stopped the room cold. These were researchers who had spent years bracing for unusual findings. Royal intermarriage in this dynasty was well documented and fully expected. What nobody had braced for was discovering exactly how close that intermarriage actually was. And in an instant, the most photographed object in the history of archaeology was no longer simply the treasure of a dynasty at the height of its glory. It was, genetically speaking, the product of a brother and a sister, a child quietly carrying the compounded cost of generations of deliberate, sacred intermarriage inside a body that would betray him before he reached 20. This was the conclusion of one landmark study, not an unchallengeable verdict closed off from future debate. And some specialists still dispute details around the edges as the science keeps evolving. But for the first time, a royal family tree had been rebuilt from molecules instead of flattering inscriptions, and the molecular version was considerably harsher than the carved one. Suddenly, those bizarre Amarna statues made a different kind of sense. The wide hips, the stretched skull, the sagging belly the artists were explicitly ordered to carve. Maybe none of it was religious symbolism. Maybe it wasn't rebellion either. Maybe it was simply biology, finally surfacing in plain sight on the walls of a brand new capital, the visible result of damage that had been quietly concentrating inside one bloodline for generations. And if Akhenaten's strange body was the early warning sign, his son's body was the bill finally coming due, in devastating, undeniable detail, the moment modern medical imaging was turned on Tutankhamun's own remains. The golden mask is so flawless, it fooled the entire world for nearly a century. The body sealed beneath it tells a completely different story. CT scans mapping bone structure down to fractions of a millimeter revealed a severely clubbed left foot, with bones rotated and shortened from birth, making a normal pain-free walk essentially impossible from his very first steps as a toddler. One toe was missing a bone entirely, a congenital defect doctors still associate with children born to closely related parents. Tissue inside parts of his feet had actually died while he was still a teenager, starved of blood by a body that couldn't distribute weight evenly across joints that had never formed correctly. His spine showed signs of curvature, and the roof of his mouth was affected by a cleft palate, a condition no physician in that era had the surgical skill to correct, one that almost certainly affected his speech, complicated eating, and left him chronically vulnerable to infection. And while his own skeleton was quietly failing him, the propaganda never missed a beat. Temple walls from his reign show a vigorous young king charging into battle, drawing a bow from a moving chariot, hunting lions at a full run, locked into the exact same triumphant warrior pose every pharaoh before him had claimed for himself. Not one official image hints at a limp, a cane, or a body in genuine distress, because a divine king who couldn't cross his own throne room unaided was a politically dangerous truth no kingdom could afford to admit out loud. So the artists drew him whole, and that fiction outlived him by 3,000 years. Inside his tomb, archaeologists found more than 100 walking sticks. Some were plain wood, others were gold or electrum, a few even carved with images of his enemies pinned beneath his feet, so that every single step symbolically crushed them. Many show clear wear right at the handle, exactly where a young man's palm would press down for real physical support, not ceremonial display. These weren't royal scepters meant for ritual. They were mobility aids he depended on simply to move through his own home. Then ancient DNA delivered one final brutal detail. Genetic material recovered from his remains tested positive for the most lethal strain of malaria on Earth, and not from a single infection. The evidence pointed to repeated bouts, with the most recent one still active in his bloodstream at the moment he died, hitting an immune system already weakened by everything he had inherited at the genetic level before he ever drew a single breath. Picture the full shape of that short life. A boy crowned before, the age of 10 ruling the most powerful nation on the planet, draped in gold in front of a court that needed him to look every inch a living god, while privately enduring near constant pain, unable to walk without help, trapped inside a body, failing him in almost every way a body can fail. Tutankhamun died at roughly 19, undone by congenital deformities, bone tissue slowly destroying itself, and a tropical disease his weakened system had almost nothing left to fight it with. Which raises the real question sitting underneath all of this. This was never really about one unlucky teenager. It's about how a family this powerful kept producing children this medically compromised generation after generation entirely on purpose. Because this wasn't bad luck, it was policy. Royal Egypt didn't stumble into close intermarriage by accident. It was deliberate, formalized, and treated as sacred. The belief system held that the pharaoh's bloodline carried an actual spark of divinity, and that introducing outside blood, even from another respected Egyptian family, risked corrupting the cosmic order the king was supposed to physically embody. A royal sister wasn't simply an acceptable marriage option. In many cases, she was considered the only womb pure enough to carry the next divine heir. Half-sibling marriages had already been common across this dynasty for generations. Full-sibling marriages were rarer, but never forbidden, and every time the family repeated the practice, they unknowingly raised the statistical odds of genetic disease, a risk no priest of that era had any conceivable way of detecting, but one modern science can now measure with disturbing precision. 2 unrelated parents face roughly a 3% baseline risk of a serious recessive genetic disorder in their child. 2 full siblings face something closer to 25%, a full 1 in 4 chance. Repeat that pattern across generations, and the danger compounds, concentrating the same hidden mutations until a child eventually inherits 2 damaged copies of the exact same gene from both parents at once. Everyone alive carries a handful of silent genetic flaws, quietly canceled out by a healthy copy from the other parent. Marry a stranger, and a healthy copy almost always saves you. Marry your own sibling, and you're both pulling cards from a nearly identical deck. And the cruelest part of this pattern is how invisible it stays, right up until it isn't. One brother-sister pairing might easily produce a perfectly healthy child, and the priests of that era would have read that outcome as proof the bloodline remained strong and the gods remained pleased. But every additional repetition quietly loaded the dice a little further until the damage finally surfaced. Visibly, undeniably, in twisted feet, cleft palates, and elongated skulls carved onto temple walls for the whole kingdom to see without understanding what they were actually looking at. They believed they were concentrating divine power inside their bloodline. In biological reality, they were concentrating disease. Akhenaten's unusual body was the first visible alarm bell, the earliest royal frame unable to fully hide what had been quietly accumulating for generations. His son's failing feet and collapsing immune system were that bill finally arriving in full with interest. After Tutankhamun's death, there was no surviving direct heir left to take the throne at all. Power passed instead to Ai, an elderly court official with no blood claim to royalty whatsoever, and then to Horemheb, a military commander with none either. The same dynasty that had once ruled an empire stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates under conquerors like Thutmose and Amenhotep, the Magnificent, ended with a teenager who couldn't cross his own throne room without a cane. And that collapse is exactly why later generations didn't simply move on from Akhenaten's memory. They actively went back and attacked it. His name was chiseled off monuments across the kingdom. His statues were toppled and buried in pits. His abandoned capital was deliberately dismantled and handed back to the desert sand. He was left off official king lists entirely, as though the throne had somehow skipped over his existence. For generations afterward, he survived in cultural memory mainly as an insult, referred to obliquely as the criminal of his own city, a man considered too dangerous to even name out loud. And there's a real irony sitting at the center of all of it. The exact practice this dynasty believed was protecting and purifying its sacred bloodline turned out to be the very thing slowly poisoning it from the inside. Every marriage designed to keep royal power concentrated and pure quietly made the next generation a little weaker, a little sicker, and a little less physically capable of holding on to the throne they were destroying themselves trying to preserve. By the time that warning had been carved into Akhenaten's own strange body, it was already far too late for anyone in that era to read it correctly. The face on those temple walls was never an artistic accident or a clever political message. It was simply the truth, eventually forced out into the open by genetics, by bone scans, and finally by a sealed laboratory in modern Cairo, more than 3,000 years after the first chisel struck the first stone. The most powerful royal dynasty in the ancient world didn't fall to an invading army, a famine, or a popular uprising. It eroded slowly from the inside, one carefully arranged royal marriage at a time, until there was no viable heir left standing to claim the crown at all. The man on the throne was the early warning. The boy buried beneath the golden mask was the proof, and the next,